Joe DiMaggio and Frank Sinatra both promised Marilyn Monroe they would always be there, but only one of them kept that promise. On a warm night in June 1962, Frank broke his promise for the last time, and 52 days later, Joe DiMaggio banned him from Marilyn's funeral. Joe sat in a funeral director's office with a pen in his hand and a list of names. One by one, he crossed them out. Peter Lawford, crossed out. Dean Martin, crossed out. Sammy Davis Jr., crossed out. Then he came to a name that made his hand shake. Frank Sinatra, the man who had been Marilyn's closest friend in Hollywood, the man who had promised to always be there. Joe stared at that name for 3 full minutes. He was thinking about a promise Frank had made, a promise Frank had broken, and now Marilyn was no longer with them, and Frank wanted to pretend he had been there for her. Joe's pen moved across the paper with such force it nearly tore through. Frank Sinatra. Banned. It was August 8th, 1962. 4 days since they had found Marilyn in her bedroom. 4 days since the phone call that shattered Joe's heart. And now he was deciding who deserved to say goodbye to the woman he had loved for 15 years. The woman who had called him in the middle of the night when she was scared. The woman Hollywood had used up and thrown away. The funeral director cleared his throat. Mr. DiMaggio, some of these names are very prominent people. Are you certain? Joe looked up. His eyes were red. I'm certain. But Mr. Sinatra, he was very close to Miss Monroe. Joe's jaw tightened. Was he? Everyone thought Frank had been close to Marilyn. Everyone thought the Rat Pack had been her family, but Joe knew the truth. Joe had been there at 2 a.m. when Marilyn called crying. Joe had driven through the night more times than he could count, and where had Frank been? Joe looked back at the list. 31 names, 31 people who would be allowed inside. Westwood Memorial Park. Not one was famous, not one was from Hollywood. Her acting coach, her housekeeper, her doctor, the people who had actually shown up when it mattered. If you ban these people, there will be press coverage. Let them ask questions. Joe stood up. This funeral is for Marilyn, not for Hollywood, not for the cameras. And she deserves to be surrounded by people who loved her when the lights were off. But to understand why Joe crossed out Frank Sinatra's name, why he banned the most famous entertainer in the world, you have to go back 3 years. Back to 1959, a phone call that would change everything. 3 years earlier, February 14th, 1959. Joe DiMaggio was living in San Francisco trying to move on. They had been divorced for 4 years, but he still loved her. That Valentine's Day night, his phone rang at 2:47 in the morning. It was Marilyn. She was crying so hard she could barely speak. Joe, I need you home. Home! She had not called it home in 4 years. Not since the divorce. Not since she had chosen Hollywood over him. But at 2:47 in the morning, alone and scared, Marilyn Monroe used that word. Home. Joe did not ask questions. He grabbed his keys and got in his car. San Francisco to Los Angeles, 400 miles, 8 hours if you obeyed the speed limit. Joe made it in 6. He drove through the night with the radio off, trying not to think about what might be happening. He did not know if she would still be alive. The last time she had called crying, she had ended up in a hospital. Marilyn had sounded so small, so broken. Joe had always known 2 different Marilyns. There was Marilyn Monroe, the platinum blonde goddess who smiled for the cameras. And then there was Norma Jeane, the scared little girl from foster homes who never believed she was good enough. Joe had fallen in love with Norma Jeane. Hollywood loved Marilyn Monroe, and Marilyn could not figure out which one she was supposed to be. Joe pulled up to her Brentwood home at 8:32. The house looked perfect. White walls, neat lawn, expensive cars. But Joe knew better. He knew what it looked like when Marilyn was falling apart behind those walls. He knocked. No answer. Marilyn? The door opened. No makeup, her hair a mess, still in last night's dress, her eyes red and swollen. She looked at Joe and collapsed into his arms. He caught her, let her cry until she did not have any tears left. What happened? Frank threw a party. Everyone was there. Dean, Sammy, all of them. And I thought it would be fun. I thought I would feel less alone. But you felt more alone. She nodded. They were all drinking and laughing, and I just sat there thinking about how you used to hold my hand, how you never made me perform. And then everyone left, and I was alone on Valentine's Day, and I needed to hear your voice. Joe made her coffee. He made her eat. He brought her pink roses from her garden, her favorite. He held her hand until she stopped shaking, and he made her a promise. I will always come when you call. Always. No matter what time, no matter where I am. Marilyn believed him, because Joe had never lied to her. What Joe did not know was that Frank Sinatra had made her the exact same promise. The difference was, Frank's promise had conditions. Joe's never did. 1 year later, spring of 1960, Frank Sinatra loved Marilyn Monroe, but not the way Joe did. Frank loved her the way you love a broken bird. You want to fix it, put it in a golden cage, show it off. Marilyn was falling apart. The studio demanded she lose weight. The prescriptions were piling up. The phone calls to Joe were getting desperate, and Frank thought he had the solution. Bring her into the Rat Pack, surround her with people, keep her in the spotlight where she belonged. Joe thought it was the worst idea he had ever heard. Here is what Frank believed. Marilyn was a star, and stars need to shine. Being around people who understood fame, who lived in the same rarefied air, would remind her why she was special. The Rat Pack was not just friends, they were a support system, a chosen family, and Frank was convinced that what looked like chaos from the outside was actually salvation. But Joe saw something different. He saw a woman who needed rest, not applause. Someone who craved normalcy, not another stage to perform on. Joe believed the answer was not more Hollywood, but less. Not brighter lights, but a quieter life where she could finally stop pretending. It was a fundamental difference. Frank looked at Marilyn and saw a star who needed to shine brighter. Joe looked at Marilyn and saw Norma Jeane who needed to rest. In May of 1960, Frank invited Marilyn to Vegas for a weekend. The weekend turned into a week. Then Marilyn was a fixture at the Sands Hotel, attending every show, every party. She was laughing. She was performing. She was Marilyn Monroe again. Joe called her. "How are you doing?" "I am good, Joe. Really good." "Frank's been amazing. Everyone was so nice." Joe was quiet. "Do they see you, Marilyn? Or do they see the star?" "What is that supposed to mean?" "It means, when you are sad, do they hold you? Or pour you another drink? When you cannot sleep, do they sit with you? Or invite you to another party?" "You do not understand their world, Joe." "No, I understand you, and that is the difference." They did not speak for 3 weeks. Marilyn stayed in Frank's world, the lights, the parties, the distractions. For 6 months, it seemed to work. The tabloids ran photos of her looking happy. Frank told everyone he had saved her. Until August 5th, 1960, the night Joe got a call from a hospital. Marilyn was barely breathing, and Frank Sinatra was on stage performing while the woman he swore to protect was losing her life 3 floors above him. August 5th, 1960, 1 year before Marilyn's final night. Marilyn Monroe was found unresponsive in a lossy Vegas hotel suite. Prescription bottles scattered, the phone off the hook. Frank Sinatra was performing downstairs, unaware the woman he had promised to protect was barely breathing. The housekeeper found her. She had been told by Marilyn, if something happens, call Joe. Only Joe, not the studio, not Frank. So she called Joe DiMaggio at 11:43, and Joe drove through the darkness, his hands gripping the wheel, praying he would not be too late. He arrived at the hospital at 6:15. Frank was not there. Peter Lawford was not there. Dean Martin was not there. The Rat Pack were nowhere to be found. The hospital room had no flowers. No one had brought her pink roses. Joe walked in alone, and when Marilyn opened her eyes 3 hours later, it was Joe's face she saw, not Frank's. Joe's. She started crying. "I am sorry. Do not apologize. Tell me what happened. Frank was performing, everyone was at the show, and I was in the suite, and I felt so alone, like I could disappear and no one would notice." Joe's jaw tightened. Where were they? Where was Frank? Performing. He did not know. They should have known. They are using you up, and when you are no longer here, they will just find another blonde. That is what Hollywood does. Maybe I belong in that world. No, you are Norma Jeane, and she deserves better. Frank showed up at 9:30, rumpled, worried, defensive. He had come from the casino floor. Joe was standing when Frank walked in. "Is she okay?" "She is alive. No thanks to you. That is not fair." "I did not know." "You did not know because you were not paying attention. You were too busy performing, too busy making sure everyone saw Frank Sinatra with Marilyn Monroe. I love her. You love the idea of her. You love having her at your parties, but you do not love her enough to notice when she's drowning right in front of you." Frank had no answer. "What do you want me to do?" "Leave her alone. Let her breathe." Frank left, and Joe took Marilyn back to San Francisco for 2 weeks. She slept 14 hours a day. She ate real food, no prescriptions. She sat on Joe's porch and remembered what it felt like to exist without performing, and when Frank called, Joe answered. The conversation lasted 40 seconds. Frank never forgave him. Subscribe now, because what Frank does next will break the promise he made to Joe, and you need to see how this ends. October 1961, 1 year later. Marilyn was filming Something's Got to Give, and everything was falling apart, being fired and rehired weekly. The prescriptions were back, the weight loss was extreme, and Joe did something he had never done. He asked Frank Sinatra to meet him in private. 2 men who barely tolerated each other, sitting in a dim restaurant booth. Joe had called Frank 3 days earlier. "We need to talk about Marilyn." Something in Joe's voice made Frank say yes. They sat across from each other. Joe ordered coffee. Frank ordered scotch. Neither spoke for 5 minutes. Two men who loved the same woman trying to figure out how to save her life. Frank's hand shook as he lifted his scotch. Joe's coffee sat untouched. Outside, tourists walked past, oblivious. How bad is it? Really bad. She is not sleeping, not eating. The studio is threatening to sue, and she calls me every night at 3 a.m. because she cannot breathe. Frank's face changed. I did not know. Because you are not paying attention. Frank, I am not here to fight. If we both love her, we need to do something before it is too late. What are you suggesting? We get her out of Hollywood, permanently. She comes with me. We remarry. I take her somewhere quiet where she can just be Norma Jeane again. You think she will agree? I think she's slipping away. And if we both tell her the same thing, if you stop inviting her to parties and I offer her a way out, she will choose life over fame. Frank looked down, the same hands that signed Marilyn's name on party invitations. What do you need? I need you. To let her go. Stop calling. Stop inviting her to Vegas. Stop making her feel like she has to be Marilyn Monroe every second. She cannot survive in your world. Frank knew that. He had known it since the hospital. He had just not wanted to admit it. Okay, I will stop. We will leave her alone. You promise? I promise. They shook hands. Two men with nothing in common except their love for one woman. For a moment, they were not rivals. They were allies. For 3 months, the plan worked. Marilyn cut ties with the studio. She stopped going to parties. She gained weight. She smiled. Joe was planning a wedding for November 62. He had picked out a ring, found a house in Northern California, and then Frank's phone rang. June 12th, 1962, 11 p.m., and Frank made a decision that would haunt him, a decision that would take Marilyn from this world. June 12th, 1962, 8 weeks before Marilyn's final night, Frank Sinatra called Marilyn Monroe at 11 o'clock. Joe was there, helping her pack up the old Marilyn and make room for the peaceful existence they had planned. And Joe heard Marilyn sigh, I cannot, Frank. I promised Joe. A pause. Joe watched the conflict in her eyes. No, I am done with that world. Another pause. Marilyn's hand tightened on the phone. Frank, please do not ask me to choose. Joe's stomach dropped. He knew what Frank was doing, pulling her back, reminding her of the lights and the feeling of being Marilyn Monroe. And Joe knew what was waiting, the longest pause. Marilyn closed her eyes, and then she said the words that broke Joe's heart. Okay, just one night. She hung up. The guilt on her face was crushing. If you go, you will not come back. Not really. It is just one night. That is what you said last time. Marilyn, Frank is not your friend. He makes you feel special by keeping you in the world that is destroying you. Just a small gathering. I will be back tomorrow. You are going to choose him over us. It is not a choice. It is always one night until it is not. Marilyn left at midnight. Joe waited. She had promised to be home by noon. Noon came and went. Joe called. No answer. He called at 3. No answer. At 6, at 9, at midnight. Nothing. Joe did not hear from Marilyn for 3 days. When she came back, she was different. The prescriptions were back. Her eyes were distant. She could barely look at Joe. She smelled like cigarettes and champagne and parties that go too long. What happened? Nothing. We just talked and laughed. Joe could see the lie, the shame. She had fallen back into the darkness. 3 months of progress vanished. He promised me he would stop. He looked me in the eye, and the first time things got boring, he called. Because Frank does not want you happy. He wants you to need him. That is not fair. Is it not? I cannot do this anymore. I cannot save you if you will not let me. I cannot watch you choose them over yourself. Over us. I do not know how to be just Norma. Jeane, I have been Marilyn Monroe for too long, then learn, or do not, but I cannot be here while you figure it out. Joe moved back to San Francisco the next day. He told Marilyn to call when she was ready to really leave Hollywood, when she was ready to choose life over fame. The call never came. 52 days later, she was no longer with them. Drop a comment right now. Should Joe have stayed and kept fighting for Marilyn, or was he right to walk away? August 5th, 1962, the night everything ended. Joe got the call at 5:23. Marilyn was no longer with them. The first person he called was Frank. He needed to know. Frank answered on the 6th ring, groggy. Hello? Frank, it is Joe. Marilyn, she is no longer here. Silence. What? They found her this morning. Were you there? When did you last talk to her? I have not talked to her in weeks. And that told Joe everything. Frank had been asleep, comfortable, living his life while Marilyn was slipping away alone. The Rat Pack had not even known. Joe hung up. He got in his car and drove to Los Angeles. He arrived at 9. Police were there. Reporters were gathering. The circus. Everything Marilyn had hated. Joe pushed through. He had a key. The house felt abandoned. Prescription bottles on the nightstand, dishes in the sink, mail piled up. Signs that Marilyn had been falling apart and no one had noticed. No one had come by. No one had called. The neighbors told police they had not seen any famous friends in weeks. No Rat Pack visits. No Frank. Marilyn had been alone. Completely alone. Joe stood in her bedroom, the bed unmade, the phone off the hook, and on her nightstand was a photo of Joe and Marilyn from their wedding. She had been holding it. That destroyed him. That in her last moments she held a picture of him. Not Frank, not Hollywood. Him. Frank arrived an hour later, shattered, red eyes, shaking hands. He saw Joe and started to speak, but Joe cut him off. "Where were you?" Frank's mouth opened. "Where were any of you? Dean, Sammy, Peter? You were her family. You promised. Where were you?" "I did not know." "You did not know because you were not paying attention. Too busy living your life, performing, throwing parties, and Marilyn was here, alone, scared, and no one came. I loved her. Did you? Because love is not a phone call once a month. Love is not inviting someone to parties when it is convenient. Love is showing up, and you did not show up. Frank left. He could not handle Joe's grief, the weight of knowing he had failed. Joe stood in Marilyn's bedroom and made a decision. She had been Hollywood's toy for 15 years. Now that she was gone, she belonged to the people who had actually loved her. But what Joe did not know yet was what Frank had done at that party, the party in June. And when Joe found out 3 days later, it would make his decision to ban Frank not just justified, but merciful. 3 days after Marilyn's passing. August 8th, 1962. Now, you understand what that list meant. Not about grudges, not about jealousy, about one simple question. Who had the right to mourn Marilyn Monroe? Only the people who had been there when she needed them. Frank Sinatra had not shown up. None of them had, but there was more. 2 days after Marilyn left this world, Joe received a call from Peter Lawford's housekeeper. The woman was crying. She had to tell someone what really happened at that party in June, the party that broke her. Frank had brought photographers, not paparazzi. Photographers he invited, he wanted publicity shots, a carefully staged candid evening with the Rat Pack. It was supposed to look spontaneous, but Marilyn felt ambushed, betrayed, used. She had thought it was a quiet gathering, instead a photo opportunity. And when she tried to leave, Frank convinced her to stay. Just a few more shots. The world loves seeing you smile. Joe sat in that funeral director's office remembering, and he understood. Frank had broken his promise not from cruelty, but something worse. Thoughtlessness. The casual selfishness of someone who could not imagine that what he wanted might destroy someone else. The list had 31 names. Marilyn's acting coach, her housekeeper, her psychiatrist, a few childhood friends, her makeup artist, her hairdresser, the people who had seen Norma Jeane, the people who had held her hand and never asked for anything. Not one Hollywood name. They did not love her. They loved being seen with her. They loved saying they knew Marilyn Monroe. They loved the parties and the photographs, but they did not love her. Mr. DiMaggio, these are very powerful people. I do not care. Joe picked up the pen. No press, no cameras, no photographers, no celebrity entrances, no spectacle. This would be small, private, dignified. Everything Marilyn's life had not been allowed to be. Are you certain about Mr. Sinatra? Were they close? He was not there when she was scared. Not there when she called crying. Not there in the hospital. Not there in her last days. He had 36 years to show up. Where was he? The funeral director had no answer. Joe came to Frank's name again. He stared. For a moment, his hand hesitated. Despite everything, Joe knew Frank had loved Marilyn, a selfish way, a destructive way, but a way that had felt real to Frank. Joe thought about the promise Frank made in that restaurant and the phone call on June 12th, Frank calling her, breaking his promise, bringing photographers to her safe space, destroying everything. The pen moved. Frank Sinatra. Banned. Joe's hand did not shake. It was not anger. It was sadness, disappointment, and fierce protectiveness. If Joe could not protect Marilyn in life, he would protect her dignity now. I will make sure security knows who is permitted. When is the service? August 8th, Wednesday afternoon. Good. The day of the funeral, Frank Sinatra showed up anyway. He stood outside the gates wearing dark sunglasses surrounded by photographers. The cameras caught everything. Frank's rigid posture, his hands in his pockets, the way he kept staring at the gates. He sent a note inside. For Joe, personal. Joe was standing near Marilyn's casket when the guard handed him the envelope. He opened it, read it, then again. His face did not change. He folded it carefully, put it in his pocket, and looked at the guard. Tell him, No. Frank Sinatra was turned away from Marilyn Monroe's funeral. The most famous entertainer in the world, standing outside iron gates while inside, a baseball player said goodbye. The photographers captured everything, and one photographer caught something no one else noticed. Frank was crying. The guard delivered Joe's message. "I am sorry, Mr. Sinatra. You are not on the list. Can you ask him again? Please, just tell him I need to say goodbye." The guard disappeared, came back 2 minutes later. "I am sorry, sir. The answer is no." Frank stood there. He could hear music from inside, could see. People moving through the chapel. 31 people who had been invited, and he was not one of them. A reporter approached. "Mr. Sinatra, why do you think Joe DiMaggio banned you?" Frank took off his sunglasses. His eyes were red and wet, and for once Frank Sinatra told the truth without performing, because I was not there when it mattered. The reporter tried to ask more, but Frank was already walking away, back to his car, back to his life, a life that would continue without Marilyn, a life where he would live with the knowledge that he had failed her. Inside the chapel, Joe stood at the front, small, quiet, dignified. No cameras, no press, no spectacle. Just 31 people who had known the real Marilyn, who had loved Norma Jeane. Joe's eulogy was 3 minutes. He did not talk about Marilyn Monroe, the movie star. He talked about Norma Jeane, the girl who loved poetry, who made terrible coffee, who laughed at his jokes, who called him in the middle of the night, who deserved so much better. If she had lived, Joe said, his voice breaking, she would have been happy. She would have had the quiet life she wanted. She would have been loved for who she was. He placed roses on her casket, pink roses, her favorite, the same ones he had brought her that morning in '59 when she called him home. And he made a promise to a room that understood. "I will come back, every week, for as long as I live. She will never be alone again." But there was one more thing Joe had not shared, one more piece to this story, something Frank had written in that note, something that would explain everything. Joe kept that promise. For 20 years, he sent roses 3 times a week, pink roses, always pink. He never missed a week. The roses always arrived. Frank tried to apologize over the years. He called, he sent letters, he tried to arrange meetings. Joe never responded, not once, because what was there to say? Frank had broken his promise, and that note Frank sent, Joe kept it until the day he left this world in 1999. It was found among his belongings, and when people read what Frank had written, they understood why Joe could never forgive him. The note that explained everything. Frank Sinatra's note to Joe DiMaggio, dated August 8, 1962, found in Joe's personal effects. "Joe, you were right. I did not protect her. I thought I was helping, but I was just another person keeping her in a world that was destroying her. I'm sorry. She deserved you, not me. She deserved someone who loved her more than the spotlight. Let me say goodbye, please. Frank." Joe never responded. He never needed to. Because on the back, in Joe's handwriting, were 4 words. "I told you so." Those 4 words were not cruel, they were just true. Joe had told Frank, he had warned him. He had sat across from him in that restaurant and said, "If we both love her, we need to get her out of Hollywood." And Frank had agreed, and then Frank called her anyway, brought photographers to her safe space, made her perform one more time. Joe kept that note for 37 years. And every year on Marilyn's birthday, he would take it out, read Frank's apology, turn it over, and read his own response. "I told you so." Then he would fold it and put it back, because some promises, when broken, can never be forgiven. Some failures are permanent. The difference between Joe and Frank was not that one loved Marilyn more. They both loved her. But Joe loved Marilyn enough to give up the spotlight version of her. Frank loved Marilyn but could not imagine her without it. Joe's love said, "Come away. Be ordinary. Be safe." Frank's love said, "Shine brighter. You were made for this. The world needs to see you." And Marilyn, caught between those 2 versions, chose the one that felt more like her, until it destroyed her. For 20 years, Joe sent roses to her grave, 3 times a week, pink roses, always pink. He never missed a delivery, not when traveling, not when sick. The roses always arrived, a quiet reminder that someone had loved Norma Jeane exactly as she was. Frank Sinatra lived another 36 years. He performed for presidents, he sang for millions, he became a legend. But in interviews, late in his life, when people asked about his biggest regret, Frank would get quiet. And if the interviewer was perceptive, they would notice Frank touching his wrist, the same gesture Joe had when he thought about the watch he gave away. Frank never said Marilyn's name in those moments, but everyone knew. Here is what Joe understood that Frank never did. Loving someone is not about making them feel special. It is about keeping them safe. It is not about showing them off. It is about creating a world where they do not need to perform. It is not about the spotlight. It is about the quiet moments when the lights go off and it is just two people who see each other completely. Joe's decision to ban Frank was not revenge. It was the last act of protection Joe could give Marilyn. In life, she had been a spectacle. Now she would have dignity. In life, she had been Hollywood's property. Now she belonged to the people who had actually loved her. Joe DiMaggio left this world in 1999. He was buried near Marilyn Monroe. Same cemetery, same view of the California sky, and on the day they lowered Joe into the ground, someone left a bouquet of pink roses on Marilyn's grave. Frank Sinatra had been gone for 1 year. The roses were not from him. Some gestures of love do not need to be signed. Some promises are kept forever. Joe DiMaggio kept his promise to Marilyn for 20 years after she left this world. 3 pink roses, 3 times a week, never missing once. That is what real love looks like. If this story moved you, share this story with someone who needs to understand the difference between love that protects and love that destroys. Hit that subscribe button and give this video a like and drop a comment. Was Joe right to ban Frank?